Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're wading into, well, let's just say some pretty complex territory. We're looking at that collision point where deeply held faith, ancient prophecies, and documented history seem to clash head on. Specifically, we're examining some really prominent prophecies in Judaism that critics and historians too often point to as being discredited or maybe failed.
Yeah.
And our goal here isn't just to list them. We want to unpack the actual source material, understand which predictions are involved, sure, but also how different groups, believers, other faiths, non-believers interpret what happened. It's about perspective, really, and navigating all this information.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to set the stage, theologically speaking. In Judaism, a prophet, a nophio, isn't primarily a fortune teller. They're fundamentally a messenger, calling people back to the covenant with God. So a lot of prophecy, maybe even most, is inherently conditional. Think of it like a divine warning or promise. Blessings follow obedience, curses follow rebellion. You know, Jonah and Nineveh is the classic case, right? The city repented, the destruction didn't happen, the prophecy achieved its moral goal, even though the predicted event was averted.
Okay, but the real friction starts when a prophecy doesn't seem conditional, right? When it sounds absolute. And there's actually a test for this, laid out right there in the text in Deuteronomy 18.22. It basically says, look, if a prophet claims to speak for God and the thing they predict doesn't happen, then God didn't send that message. So the whole debate we're diving into today kind of circles around applying that verse to historical events. Let's maybe start with the biggest one, the real foundation for Jewish messianic hope, the promise of an everlasting Davidic dynasty.
Yeah, that's the cornerstone, truly. We're talking around the 10th century BCE. The prophet Nathan comes to King David. And the language in 2 Samuel 7.16 is, well, pretty unambiguous. God says David's house, his kingdom, his throne, they'll be established forever. This wasn't just about David himself. It was establishing a royal line that would lead Israel, guide them, ideally toward this future of peace and restoration. A continuous line of kings in Jerusalem, supposedly perpetual.
Perpetual, yeah, but then you run smack into history. Because that unbroken line ruling from Jerusalem, it ended, definitively. 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, and the end wasn't just political, it was starkly personal and brutal. The last king, Zedekiah, captured, forced to watch his own sons executed right in front of him, then blinded, dragged off to exile. I mean, it sends a message of absolute finality. That line was severed, and for, over 2,500 years now, no king from David's line has ruled in Jerusalem.
The historical break is undeniable. But the mainstream Jewish understanding, for millennia, hasn't seen this as prophecy failing. Instead, it's seen as a deferral, a necessary postponement, that forever promise. It will be fulfilled just later. With the coming of the Mashiach, the Messiah, this future figure, who must be a descendant of David, is expected to achieve all those things the prophets spoke about. Rebuild the temple, gather the exiles back to Israel, usher in an era of universal peace, the Olam Haba.
Okay, I can see the theological logic there, the need to uphold God's promise. But step outside that belief system for a second. To a critic, wouldn't that just sound like moving the goalposts? The promise of forever fails within 400 years, so you say, oh, it'll happen thousands of years later instead. How does that maintain credibility?
That's precisely the tension, isn't it? The Jewish response isn't just blind hope, though. It's tied to the nature of the covenant itself. God made an oath to David. If God is all-powerful and faithful, that oath can't ultimately fail. So if the human kings failed to uphold their end, the divine plan adapts. It requires a future perfect age of the Messiah to fulfill it. It shifts the meaning of forever from, say, uninterrupted continuity to guaranteed eventual realization.
All right, so that's the grand sort of end times promise. Let's shift gears now to something maybe even trickier for prophetic claims. Specific time-bound predictions tied to historical figures and events we can actually check. And for this, we really need to look at the prophet Ezekiel. He was writing during the Babylonian exile around the 6th century BCE.
Right. Ezekiel gives us two really detailed, very specific examples. Both involve the big figure of the time, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. If the Davidic prophecy is complex because of its vast timescale, these are complex because they're so precise.
Let's zero in on the first one, the prophecy against Tyre, the powerful Phoenician island city.
Okay, Ezekiel 26 lays it out in detail. It says Nebuchadnezzar will utterly destroy Tyre, make it like a bare rock, a place for fishermen to dry nets. And crucially, it says Tyre would never be rebuilt. It predicts a complete permanent destruction and implies Nebuchadnezzar would get rich from the plunder.
Okay, now the history. What actually happened? Nebuchadnezzar did besiege Tyre for an incredibly long time, 13 years, roughly 585 to 572 BCE, one of the longest sieges in ancient history. He did destroy the mainland part of Tyre, Ushu, but the island fortress, it held out. And sources suggest that by the time the Babylonians breached the mainland defenses, most of the wealth and population had been moved to the island. So the key point for critics is, Nebuchadnezzar apparently gained very little spoil for this massive 13-year effort, and Tyre itself survived. It was rebuilt. It was later conquered, quite devastatingly, by Alexander the Great, sure, but that was over 200 years later. And even then, it wasn't permanently destroyed. It's still a major city today, which seems to directly contradict never be rebuilt.
Exactly. That failure in the specific agent, Nebuchadnezzar, not getting the predicted spoil and not achieving permanent destruction, is probably the most cited example against Ezekiel's divine inspiration. But here's where it gets fascinating from a theological perspective. The Jewish interpretation doesn't actually ignore Nebuchadnezzar's, let's say, limited success. The text itself seems to acknowledge it.
Wait, the text itself offers a kind of course correction, a theological fix for the fact that Nebuchadnezzar didn't get paid, essentially. That's remarkable. Why is that so important?
It's absolutely vital for maintaining the integrity of the prophecy from that perspective. Later, in Ezekiel chapter 29, God basically says, because Nebuchadnezzar and his army worked so hard against Tyre and got no wages for it, God will give him Egypt instead as compensation. The internal logic is something like this. The primary divine goal, damaging Tyre's pride and power, was partly achieved, mainland destroyed, city weakened. But the secondary goal, the plunder for the agent, failed. So to keep the sort of divine moral economy in balance, God designates a new target, Egypt, as Nebuchadnezzar's reward for the effort spent at Tyre.
Which leads us perfectly into case study number 2, the prophecy against Egypt. This was supposed to be the compensation package, right?
Yeah.
And the specifics here, again, are really striking when compared to the historical record. Ezekiel predicts Egypt will be handed over to Nebuchadnezzar. It will become utterly desolate, a wasteland. And here's the time-bound part. It will remain uninhabited for 40 years. This prediction is dated around 587 BCE.
In history? Well, it records a very different story. Nebuchadnezzar did invade Egypt, likely around 568 BCE, about 20 years later. But there's no evidence, not Babylonian, not Egyptian, not Greek, of a successful conquest, massive plunder, or anything remotely like a 40-year period of desolation where the land was uninhabited. Egypt seems to have remained relatively stable, populous, a major political and economic player throughout that entire period. This is where critics really dig in, referencing that Deuteronomy test. You have the named agent, Nebuchadnezzar, the specific outcome, uninhabited wasteland, and the explicit time frame, 40 years. History seems to show that none of those specific conditions were met. That's much harder to explain away with conditionality or simple deferral, isn't it?
Is there anything in the non-biblical records, any hint from Egyptian or Babylonian sources that Egypt went through some kind of major collapse around then, even if not exactly 40 years?
Oh, boy.
Or is the silence just overwhelming?
The silence from contemporary sources about such a catastrophic event is, frankly, deafening. It strongly supports Egypt's continued stability. Theological responses have to get more interpretive here. Some argue it meant a period of political decline or humiliation, not literal emptiness. Or perhaps the 40 years were symbolic. But that requires reading language like uninhabited for 40 years in a way that, you have to admit, feels non-literal to an outside observer looking at the plain text.
Okay, let's pivot now. We've seen the prophecies and the historical sticking points. How do others outside of traditional Judaism process this information? How do other major faiths or secular viewpoints handle these apparent failures?
Good question. Let's start with the Christian perspective. Generally, Christians accept the Hebrew prophets as inspired, but they often interpret prophecies as being conditional, or using hyperbole, or having multiple layers of fulfillment. For the Davidic dynasty, the interpretation is that it was fulfilled, but spiritually, through Jesus Christ. His lineage connects him to David, and his kingship is seen as spiritual, with the promised peace coming at his second coming. For Tyre and Egypt, a common approach is partial fulfillment, or divine orchestration over time. So Nebuchadnezzar started the job on Tyre, maybe weakened it significantly. God's will was still ultimately done, even if Alexander the Great was the instrument centuries later. The divine intent unfolds, even if the first-named agent didn't complete every detail.
Interesting. Now, what about the Islamic view? It has a unique take on the previous scriptures.
It does. Islam views the original Torah and prophetic books, the Tanakh, as divinely revealed. However, it also holds the doctrine of Tarif, the belief that these texts were corrupted or altered by human scribes over time.
So any perceived failure in the biblical text isn't God's error or even the prophet's error. It's blamed on later corruption of the text itself. So the Davidic line ending or Egypt not being desolate for 40 years, that's seen as evidence of textual alteration within the Bible.
Exactly. The failure isn't seen as divine, but human interference with the divine message. Sometimes these historical discrepancies found in the Bible are even presented as reasons why the Quran was necessary as the final, uncorrupted revelation.
Okay, and then the third major viewpoint, the non-believer, or what's often called the historical critical perspective.
Right. For this group, these specific time-bound failures, particularly Ezekiel's predictions about Tyre getting no spoil from Nebuchadnezzar and Egypt's 40-year desolation, are seen as strong evidence against divine inspiration. They're viewed as proof of human authorship. The argument is simple. If a being claiming omniscience makes specific factual predictions about the future that turn out to be wrong according to historical evidence, then the source probably wasn't omniscient. It suggests the texts reflect the hopes, fears, and maybe intelligence failures of human writers living in the 6th century BCE, not supernatural dictation.
And this view often brings in a couple of key academic arguments to bolster its case, doesn't it? The first one is vaticinium ex eventer, prophecy after the event.
Yeah, the idea here is that maybe the prophecies in the Bible that are remarkably accurate, like, say, predicting Cyrus the Great by name, or the return from Babylonian exile, might have actually been written after those things happened. They were framed as predictions to give the text authority. But the ones that failed, like Ezekiel on Tyre's spoils or Egypt's 40 years, those were genuine predictions made before the events, and they simply got it wrong, revealing their human origin.
That's the argument. And the second one draws from psychology, cognitive dissonance theory. This theory suggests that when people hold a very deep belief, like the divine inspiration of Scripture, and they encounter strong evidence contradicting that belief, like Egypt clearly not being uninhabited for 40 years, it creates intense mental discomfort, dissonance. And the human mind works hard to resolve that discomfort. So developing interpretations like it was conditional, or it's symbolic, or it'll be fulfilled way in the future by the Messiah can be seen, from this perspective, as psychological mechanisms. Ways to reduce the dissonance and preserve the core belief rather than concluding the original text might have been mistaken. These interpretations become essentially defense mechanisms.
Before we wrap this up, maybe touch quickly on one more, the prophecy against Damascus in Isaiah, another interesting case of prediction versus outcome.
Sure. Isaiah, writing earlier, around the 8th century BCE, predicts Damascus will cease to be a city and become a heap of ruins. And historically, Damascus was hit hard. The Assyrians, under Tiglath-Pileser III, conquered it around 732 BCE, causing significant destruction and deportation.
Damascus is famously one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It certainly never ceased to be a city. It was damaged, yes, but not obliterated permanently. So how is that one usually handled?
Here, the common interpretation, even within traditional views, leans towards hyperbole. It's seen as powerful prophetic rhetoric warning of devastating judgment and conquest by the Assyrians. The language conveys the severity of the blow, the near total destruction, rather than a literal absolute promise that Damascus would permanently vanish from the map. It's about the impact and the warning. So pulling it all together, you really see this fundamental tension. This debate over failed prophecies lands right at the intersection of faith and history. For believers, there's this dynamic relationship. God's plans can involve conditions, human responses like repentance matter, timelines can be deferred. The ultimate divine purpose and promise remain intact, even if the path looks different than expected.
While for critics and many historians, the specific verifiable predictions that didn't pan out, especially those tied to names like Nebuchadnezzar and dates or durations like 40 years, are compelling evidence. Evidence pointing towards human authors working within their own historical moment, with limited knowledge of the future. It's a basic disagreement on how to read these ancient texts. So, what's the big takeaway for us listening today?
I think it's seeing how incredibly powerful an idea like the Messiah, rooted in that Davidic promise, has been. Its persistence for 2,500 years, despite history not delivering the predicted outcomes like global peace or a rebuilt temple yet, shows the sheer force of this narrative in shaping culture, religion, and even politics.
Absolutely, and that leads perfectly to a final thought, something for you to really chew on after this. Think about that dynamic, the power of narrative stability versus cold, hard, historical accuracy. When does the deep human need for a future promise, a guaranteed positive outcome like the Messianic age, become strong enough to outweigh historical evidence of past predictions? Well, not quite working out. And how does that very tension, that faith and its deferred fulfillment, continue to shape identities, communities, and even political actions, particularly in places like the Middle East, right up to the present day? That interplay between past text, present reality, and future hope, it's something worth keeping in mind.